1965, Small's Paradise, the kind of place where Harlem's power players came to be seen and where desperate men came hoping to be noticed. Frank Lucas had been coming there for 6 months, always sitting in the same corner booth, always ordering the same drink he could barely afford, always watching the same man, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. The name alone carried weight in Harlem, not because Bumpy was the loudest or the most violent, because he was the most disciplined. In a world built on chaos, Bumpy Johnson understood control, and Frank Lucas, 34 years old with nothing but hunger and observation skills, understood that if he wanted to survive in Harlem, he needed to learn from the only man who'd mastered it. But Bumpy Johnson didn't take on students, he barely acknowledged strangers, and Frank Lucas was nobody, just another ambitious kid from the South trying to make something of nothing in a city that ate people like him for breakfast. This is the story of how a desperate man earned the attention of a legend, and how 3 words changed everything. To understand why Frank Lucas was sitting in that corner booth night after night, you need to understand where he came from, not just geographically, psychologically. 1946. Frank arrived in Harlem at 21 with $40 in his pocket and a promise he'd made to himself at 12, never be powerless again. He'd left North Carolina after watching the Ku Klux Klan tie his cousin to a tree, not to kill him, just to remind him of his place. That night, young Frank realized something that would shape his entire life. The world was built on power, and if you didn't have it, you were just waiting to be crushed. So he came to Harlem looking for power. What he found instead was poverty in a different form. No tobacco fields, no rural desperation, just urban survival, equally brutal, equally unforgiving. He started at the bottom, running numbers for local operators, delivering packages he knew better than to open, watching men rise and fall based on decisions made in the span of heartbeats, and always he was learning. By 1950, Frank was making enough to eat regularly and rent a room that didn't smell like death. But he wasn't rising, he was surviving, and survival wasn't enough, not for a man who'd promised himself he'd matter. That's when he first saw Bumpy Johnson. It was a Wednesday afternoon. Frank was standing outside a barbershop on 116th Street when a black Cadillac pulled up. No screeching tires, no dramatic entrance. Smooth stop, and out stepped a man in his 50s wearing a suit that cost more than Frank made in 6 months. But it wasn't the suit that caught Frank's attention. It was the way everyone on the street changed when Bumpy appeared. Conversations didn't stop, people didn't stare, but there was a shift, a recognition, the kind of respect that can't be demanded or bought, only earned. Bumpy walked into the barber shop, and Frank stood there for 10 minutes just watching the door. When Bumpy came out, his hair freshly cut, he walked past Frank without a glance, but Frank felt something shift inside him. He'd just seen what power actually looked like, and it wasn't loud, it wasn't violent, it was quiet, assured, inevitable. From that day forward, Frank studied Bumpy Johnson the way some men study scripture. He learned Bumpy's routines, the restaurants he frequented, the clubs he owned, the people he trusted. Frank wasn't stalking him. He was learning the patterns of power, because Frank understood something crucial. If you want to become something, you first have to understand how it operates. For 5 years, Frank watched. He took jobs that put him in proximity to Bumpy's operations without directly interfering. He observed how Bumpy handled disputes, how he built loyalty, how he separated business from emotion even when the business got bloody. And what Frank saw was discipline. Bumpy didn't react, he responded. Bumpy didn't threaten, he implied. Bumpy didn't take unnecessary risks. He calculated probabilities and only moved when the odds were overwhelmingly in his favor. By 1960, Frank Lucas had become a competent operator in his own right. He ran a small numbers operation, had a crew of 5 men, made enough money to wear decent clothes and rent an apartment in a building that didn't have rats. But he'd hit a ceiling, because in Harlem there were territories, and all the real territories belonged to men with connections Frank didn't have. He needed a mentor, he needed access, he needed Bumpy Johnson. But Bumpy Johnson didn't take meetings with mid-level operators, so Frank had to find another way. That's how he ended up at Small's Paradise night after night, sitting in that corner booth, making himself visible without making himself a nuisance. He was there when Bumpy arrived. He was there when Bumpy left. He never approached, never tried to force a conversation, just maintained a presence, a quiet, persistent presence that said, "I'm here, I'm patient, I'm worth noticing." 6 months, 26 weeks of showing up, ordering drinks he could barely afford, watching without staring, waiting without desperation showing on his face. And then on a Thursday night in March 1965, Bumpy Johnson walked over to Frank's booth and sat down. Frank's heart was hammering, but his face stayed calm, because he'd learned that from Bumpy too: never show what you're feeling. Power lives in the space between emotion and expression. Bumpy didn't say hello. Didn't introduce himself, just looked at Frank with eyes that had seen every kind of hustle, every kind of ambition, every kind of man. "You've been here a while," Bumpy said. His voice was quiet, not a whisper, just controlled, every word measured. "Yes, sir," Frank replied. "Why?" One word, but it contained multitudes. "Why are you here? Why do you keep coming back? Why should I care?" Frank could have lied, could have made up some story about coincidence or business or just liking the music. But he'd spent 5 years studying this man, and he knew one thing above all else: Bumpy Johnson respected honesty more than cleverness. "I want to learn from you," Frank said simply. Bumpy's expression didn't change. "A lot of people want to learn from me. Most of them are idiots. What makes you different?" Frank thought about that question. He could have listed his accomplishments, could have talked about his operation or his skills or his ambition, but none of that would have mattered to Bumpy. Bumpy didn't care about what you'd done. He cared about how you thought. "I don't know if I'm different," Frank said, "but I've been watching you for 5 years, and I understand. Something power isn't about being the strongest, it's about being the smartest, the most patient, the most disciplined, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to learn that discipline." Silence. Bumpy studied Frank's face, looking for cracks, for desperation, for the kind of hunger that turns men into liabilities. What he saw was something else. Determination, yes. Ambition, absolutely. But also a kind of coldness. A willingness to do what needed to be done without the emotional weight that made most men hesitate. Bumpy reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. Plain, white, sealed. He placed it on the table between them. "Make it disappear," Bumpy said. 3 words, that was the test. 3 words that contained everything Bumpy needed to know about Frank Lucas. Frank looked at the envelope, but didn't touch it. "What's inside? Does it matter?" Bumpy asked, and that was the real test. Not the envelope, not the task, but whether Frank would ask questions or simply execute. Whether he needed context or could operate on pure trust and competence. Frank met Bumpy's eyes. "No, sir, it doesn't matter." Bumpy stood up. "You have 48 hours. After that, the problem solves itself in a way neither of us will like." He walked away without another word, no instructions, no clarification, just the envelope and 3 words: "Make it disappear." Frank sat there for 5 minutes after Bumpy left, the envelope on the table like a test he hadn't known he was taking. Then he picked it up, slid it into his jacket, and walked out of Small's paradise. In the alley behind the club, Frank opened the envelope. Inside, a police report, a photograph of a man Frank didn't recognize, and an address in the Bronx. The police report detailed an arrest from 3 years ago: low-level drug possession. The suspect had been released on a technicality, but the report contained information that could connect several of Bumpy's operations to specific locations and people. It was the kind of document that, in the wrong hands, could unravel years of careful construction. The photograph showed the same man. Mid-30s, white, detective's shield visible on his belt. The address was residential, not a precinct, not an office, someone's home. Frank understood immediately what the problem was. A dirty cop had kept documentation he should have destroyed, maybe for insurance, maybe for blackmail. Either way, it was a liability, and Bumpy needed it too. Disappear. The question was how. Frank could break into the house, search for the original documents, steal them, but that assumed he could find them and that there weren't copies and that the cop wouldn't immediately know who was responsible. He could bribe the cop, but that just created a different problem. Bribery required ongoing payments and turned a document problem into a relationship problem. He could threaten the cop, but threats were clumsy. Threats created resentment and motivation for revenge. Frank thought about it for 3 hours, sitting in his apartment, turning the problem over in his mind like a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit. And then he saw it. The solution wasn't about the document. It was about the man. Frank spent the next 24 hours learning everything he could about Detective Thomas Callahan: where he drank, who he owed money to, what his habits were, what his weaknesses looked like. What Frank discovered was a man with gambling debts, a wife who didn't know about those debts, and a pattern of small corruptions that added up to a career built on moral compromises. But more importantly, Frank discovered that Callahan was investigating a robbery at a jewelry store in Manhattan. A case that was going nowhere because Callahan was a mediocre detective with no real leads. Frank made 2 phone calls. The first was to a fence he'd worked with before. The second was to Callahan's precinct. 36 hours after Bumpy gave him the envelope, Frank had arranged for the fence to anonymously tip Callahan about the jewelry robbery. The tip was good, real. It would lead Callahan to an arrest and a promotion he desperately needed. But the tip came with a condition, delivered through an intermediary. In exchange, certain old files needed to be permanently lost. Nothing dramatic, just paperwork that quietly ceased to exist. Callahan, seeing a chance to solve a high-profile case and clean up some old loose ends that could have become problematic later, agreed. The documents were destroyed, the problem disappeared, and nobody got hurt, nobody got threatened. Nobody even knew Bumpy Johnson was involved. It was elegant, surgical, the kind of solution that didn't create new problems while solving the old one. 47 hours after Bumpy handed him the envelope, Frank walked back into Small's paradise. Bumpy was at his usual table. Frank sat down across from him without asking permission. He placed a matchbook on the table. Inside the matchbook, ashes, the remains. "Police report. It's done," Frank said. Bumpy picked up the matchbook, examined the ashes, then looked at Frank with an expression that was impossible to read. How? Frank explained the solution, the gambling debts, the jewelry tip, the quiet exchange that benefited everyone and implicated no one. When Frank finished, Bumpy was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice carried something Frank couldn't quite identify. Respect, maybe, or concern. "You're colder than I thought," Bumpy said. It could have been a compliment. It could have been a warning. Frank wasn't sure which. Maybe both. "You asked me to make it disappear," Frank said. "I made it disappear." Bumpy nodded slowly. "You did, but you did it in a way that shows something about you. Most men would have kicked down the door. Would have threatened, would have made it violent. You made it invisible. Isn't that better? Better for the operation, yes, but it tells me something about how your mind works. You don't just solve problems, you think 3 steps ahead. You manipulate systems instead of people. That's rare. It's also dangerous. Dangerous how? Bumpy leaned back, because men who think like that don't just follow, they build, and eventually they outgrow their teachers. The words hung in the air between them. Frank understood what Bumpy was really saying. This wasn't just an evaluation of his skills. It was a recognition that Frank Lucas might become something Bumpy Johnson couldn't control. But Bumpy hired him anyway, because Bumpy also understood that the world was changing and he needed men who could think beyond traditional methods, men who could operate in the new landscape of law enforcement, federal investigations, and political oversight that was beginning to reshape organized crime. For the next 3 years, Frank learned at Bumpy's side how to move money without leaving trails, how to build loyalty through respect rather than fear, how to separate emotion from business even when the business got personal. And Bumpy was right. Frank did think 3 steps ahead. He did manipulate systems. And he was learning faster than Bumpy had anticipated. In 1968, when Bumpy Johnson died of a heart attack, Frank Lucas inherited not just territory, but a question that Bumpy had asked himself quietly in his final months. What happens when you create something you can't control? Because Frank took everything Bumpy taught him and pushed it further. Bumpy worked within existing systems. Frank went around them entirely. Bumpy maintained balance with the Italian families. Frank cut them out completely. Bumpy was disciplined. Frank was ruthless, and that ruthlessness came from the same coldness Bumpy had seen that night at Small's paradise. The ability to solve problems without emotional interference, to make things disappear without hesitation, to think 3 steps ahead even when those steps led into moral territory Bumpy had carefully avoided. Make it disappear wasn't just a test. It was a preview, a glimpse into how Frank Lucas would eventually operate, efficiently, invisibly, without the moral constraints that had kept Bumpy grounded. Years later, after Frank's empire collapsed, after the arrests and the trials and the cooperation with authorities, he would sometimes think about that night. Envelope, the 3 words, the look on Bumpy's face when Frank explained his solution. "You're colder than I thought." Bumpy had seen it then. The thing that would make Frank successful and eventually destroy him. The ability to make hard decisions without the weight of consequences slowing him down, to treat people like chess pieces, to manipulate systems with the precision of a surgeon and the detachment of a machine. It was what Bumpy needed. It was what Bumpy feared. And in the end, Bumpy was right to feel both things, because Frank Lucas did become something his teacher couldn't control. He built an empire that dwarfed anything Bumpy had constructed. He made millions while Bumpy had made thousands. He operated globally while Bumpy had stayed local. But he also lost everything: the empire, the money, the freedom, because the same coldness that made him successful also made him isolated, made him trust no one, made him push boundaries until those boundaries pushed back hard enough to crush him. That three-word test revealed everything, not just Frank's competence, but his fundamental nature, the way he saw the world, the way he processed problems, the way he would eventually process people. Make it disappear. Frank made a lot of things disappear over the years: documents, problems, competition, and eventually, inadvertently, his own freedom. But he never made those three words disappear. They stayed with him, a reminder of the moment Bumpy Johnson saw exactly who Frank Lucas was and chose to teach him anyway, knowing the risk, understanding the cost, recognizing that sometimes you create something that outgrows you and all you can do is watch it rise and hope it doesn't burn too bright. Bumpy Johnson died before seeing how bright Frank Lucas would burn. Maybe that was a mercy, or maybe it was a tragedy, because Bumpy would have understood what was coming in a way Frank didn't until it was too late. The test wasn't whether Frank could make the problem disappear. The test was whether he understood the difference between solving problems and becoming one, and Frank passed the first test. But he failed the second one spectacularly. That's the real story of those three words, not just what they revealed about Frank Lucas in that moment, but what they predicted about the man he would become, the empire he would build, and the isolation that would eventually consume him, make it disappear. Frank Lucas made everything disappear, eventually even himself.